So Scott Horton is a journalist, an author, and a longtime anti-war activist. He's the managing editor of the Libertarian Institute, opinion editor of antiwar.com, and the host of the Scott Horton Show. Horton is the author of the widely acclaimed Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Tonight, Scott will be speaking on the horrors of American military interventionism and what we can do about it. The title of his speech is Against the Terror Wars. Please give a round of applause for Scott Horton.
Hi, thank you everybody very much for having me. I appreciate everybody coming out. I'm not actually very much of an activist. I'm more of just kind of an information guy. So I thought, with a group like this, obviously you guys are, obviously assume all anti-war and have varying degrees of interest in the subject. And so I thought I would just kind of give a little bit of a review of the terror wars so far in the century real quick here. And I'm no demographer, okay? But I've been made aware that a lot of people who know a lot of things and are interested in a lot of things, they just don't know the first thing about this. So I just thought it's worth pointing out a little bit here, just who's who in the Middle East, a little bit. And I'm not trying to oversimplify everything, everything is about religion and ethnicity. It's just that defines a lot of the oppositional groups that we'll be talking about. So the Arabs here are in yellow. And then you have the Persians in Iran, obviously here in the middle. A lot of people, they think Arabs are just over there somewhere or something. But so they came out of Arabia, they kind of took over Mesopotamia and the Levant here, and obviously Egypt and all this. And then here in Afghanistan, we have an ethnic mix in the north, and you'll see the swath of brown there. Those are the Pashtuns, and the border actually runs right in the middle of Pashtunistan here. It's called the Durand line. That's where the British drew it to try to divide the Pashtun people, which actually succeeded in a lot of ways. And then here in the maroon, importantly, you can see is Kurdistan. This is a giant region of people who had no state and never did have a state. And their region is bisected, or pentasected, I guess, by 5 countries there. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and up even into Azerbaijan and Armenia a bit. Okay. And then, importantly, here's the sectarian map. Now, in the world, the Shia are a small minority, but in the Middle East, it's about a 50-50 split. So the Shia here are in dark green, based more in Iran, and very importantly, you can see in southern and southeastern Iraq, between Iran and Baghdad in this map. And by the way, who is a demographer is a professor named Michael Izadi, who is the guy who did these maps, and they're really great. All right, so I guess to start, basically the deal is when the Soviet Union fell apart, the idea was, okay, good, they're out of the way. And so instead of America can come home now and stop being the policeman of the world, it was now we can do anything we want and the Soviets aren't there to stop us. And you can find this really crystallized in something that was called the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992. That was written for the neoconservatives on Dick Cheney's staff when he was the Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr. And what it says is, we will not allow any near-peer competitor of any kind ever again. We've gone from a world of 2 superpowers in the bipolar world to 1 superpower. And we will never allow any country or combination of countries or regional groupings or alliances to even think about challenging us militarily. We will have basically what they call full spectrum dominance. From way over here in the New World, all across all of Eurasia and even into Africa and all of the world. Preeminence, empire. And so, and really even after the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern Europe, Russia, after the year 2000, fell into the hands of an independent leadership. Whereas Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s was basically a pushover for the Americans and the CIA doing whatever they wanted. When Putin came in, they still had the 7,000 nukes. So when he declared independence from American dominance at that point, it was just done, you know, in a day. He just had to say so. And China, of course, is our second biggest trading partner after Canada, and they're really, you know, a strategic partnership in a lot of ways, but also their Communist Politburo government is independent from the American empire and is strong enough and has the H-bombs enough to stay that way and to keep us out of there. So the idea is if we can't completely dominate these countries, we will at least have them surrounded. We'll dominate the resources of the Middle East that especially the Chinese rely on, not so much the Russians. And this is all part of the great game. In the 1990s, it was kind of a cliche, a figure of speech at the Joint Planning Staff in the Pentagon that terrorism is a small price to pay for being an empire, for being a superpower, sorry to say that right, which is the same difference, right? Euphemism, but that was their saying. Small price to pay, and you can see from their point of view how that kind of makes sense. A truck bomb goes off here or there, it kills mostly some Africans at some embassy somewhere, it hurts, it wounds the coal but doesn't sink it, and from their point of view, this is acceptable to dominate the Middle East. And it wasn't a question at all of whether it was American dominance in the Middle East that was causing the terrorism. They only kind of fudged that issue and said, no, Islam makes them hate freedom and all that after September 11th. But all through the 1990s, it was clear that the problem was the foreign policy. So that's the thing. And Al-Qaeda really started attacking the United States as early as 1989. They assassinated a right-wing radical rabbi named Kahane, whose party actually was banned in Israel for being fascist by the Supreme Court there. But anyway, they assassinated him in New York, and that was the same core of guys who attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, and then also had a plot against the UN and the Lincoln and Holland tunnels and all that, Ramzi Youssef and his group. And anyway, they attacked all through the 1990s, the embassy attacks, the Khobar Towers, which Bill Clinton blamed on Iran, but was Osama, and then September 11th. And after September 11th, all the imperialists, of course, said, well, they think that we're a paper tiger and that they can scare us away, and now we'll turn around and run away. When in fact, what they were trying to do was give, especially the Republicans, the excuse to exploit and overreact. And that was the game bin Laden was playing. It was actually the exact same game that Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter and the CIA began playing in 1979 when they started supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to provoke the Soviet Union into invading in the first place. And the lesson of Vietnam was, boy, that hurt, shouldn't have done that. Let's see if we can trick the Russians into giving themselves a Vietnam. Let's give them one. Let's give them the opportunity. Let's not contain them, let's trick them into overexpansion. And it really did help break the bank and help destroy the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And then the lesson from the Al-Qaeda guys, from the very beginning, in fact, as early as 1986, Osama bin Laden's mentor, Abdul Azam, told my friend Eric Margulies, the great journalist, that you're next. As soon as we're done with the Soviet Union, we're coming for you because you're imperialists just like them, and you're trying to dominate the Middle East, and you support Israel and Palestine and all this. And so, you know, it's on. That was the deal all along. So after September 11th, of course, they had a quick little war in Afghanistan. As far as anybody knows, it's still going on. But it was a quick little war where the bad guy got away. And importantly, because they were able to use him as a propaganda device to pretend that, look, Saddam Hussein is in league with Osama and could give his chemical weapons to Osama to use against us. Who would have cared about Saddam Hussein's alleged friendship with Osama bin Laden if he was already dead for a year and a half? So somehow, miraculously, they didn't call in the Rangers and he was able to slip away into Pakistan, and so they had their enemy. And it's the ultimate bait and switch. And especially looking back at it in hindsight, where they've gone and done a regime change in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, in Yemen against Abdullah Saleh, in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi, and they tried to do one against Bashar al-Assad in Syria here, where every one of these men wakes up and shaves their chin in the morning, and clearly every one of them, think of Saddam Hussein, Colonel Gaddafi, these men worship only themselves. They had no tie. In fact, if you want to talk about, terrorists in Libya, America and Britain supported the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in their attempts to assassinate Gaddafi in the year 2000. We'll get back to the Libyan Islamic Group and Gaddafi again. But the American people gave George Bush a writ to go kill the guys that did this. And they went and they pretended, because of the attack was on the scale of a Pearl Harbor type thing, they just sort of pretended that there was an imperial Japan of terrorists behind it, this Islamo-fascist caliphate that did this. But if you just stop, they had to steal our planes to do it. They didn't have an air force. They didn't have a naval force like the Japanese Empire had. They had to hijack American civilian aircraft to even have anything to crash in anything. It was a Hail Mary pass by a group of 400 men. But they pretended that now we have a worldwide crusade that we have to wage. When, of course, they were all just exploiting your family's fear, really, to get away with whatever they wanted, preconceived agendas that they had. And quite unfortunately, a lot of that came from a group of Israel firsters called the neoconservatives. Now, half of the neocons write for a living, and the other half of them try all day long to get a job as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy. And they do, and they're absolutely relentless. And it doesn't matter how much people hate them. It doesn't matter how much people reject them. Bill Kristol, who is the ringleader of the Out of Power faction, the writer faction, he is the driving force behind what's now the Alliance for Securing Democracy, that goes around accusing everyone who knows better of being a puppet of the Russians. And the Washington Post and the New York Times take his word for it. Bill Kristol. And they own 10 think tanks, and they won't stop. And a big part of this is their agenda is called the Clean Break. And what the Clean Break said, it was written for Benjamin Netanyahu when he was the Prime Minister of Israel the first time in 1996. And it said, what we want to do is just break the region into pieces, shatter the states into small pieces as we can. And quite incoherently, they argue that in order to weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, which supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, and both of which are backed by Iran, we need to focus on taking out Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Now, I'm going somewhere with this. So this makes no sense, right? Saddam Hussein had worked for Ronald Reagan for 8 years, invaded, Jimmy Carter gave him the green light to start it, invaded Iran after the Iranian Shiite revolution took over that country in 1979, and fought an 8-year war. 1 million people died, half on each side, in order to contain the Iranian revolution. This was the cause of the first Iraq war, was Saddam Hussein owed a lot of money to Kuwait, Saudi, and UAE, and oil prices were $10 a barrel or something, so he couldn't pay them back, and they were calling in all their loans, and they wouldn't cut him a break, and he was saying, I just fought this war to protect you. And so, in fact, Bush Sr. had told him, go ahead, what do we care? The James Baker, State Department, told him, go ahead, and they really thought that he would invade just the northern oil fields of Kuwait and occupy them. But in fact, he got carried away and took over the whole country, and then that became a diplomatic problem, and they ended up, that was the fatal error, was then occupying Saudi Arabia in order to launch Iraq War I to force Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Because then at that point, after the war, the Bush administration encouraged the Shia to rise up against Saddam Hussein and the Kurds as well. And it's a Sunni minority-dominated government was there. So it's 60% supermajority Shia Arab, 20% Sunni Arab, and 20% Kurds, who are Sunnis, but they're Kurds, so different alliance there. And they were certainly on the outs with Hussein. But so Bush Sr. encouraged them to rise up, and they did. But then they thought better of it, and they realized, we're undoing the Reagan-era policy of waging this war to contain Iran and the Shiite revolution, and we're importing them into Iraq. The Iranian-backed Shiite militias were already coming across the border into Iraq. So they panicked and they cut them off and left them high and dry like the Bay of Pigs, and Saddam Hussein slaughtered them all, a couple of 100,000 of them, in order to put down the insurrection. So then that became the excuse for staying in Saudi Arabia for 8 years, through the whole 10 years, through the whole Bill Clinton years, the rest of Bush Sr. and into Bill Clinton years, in order to bomb and blockade Iraq, in order to contain Saddam's punishment of the Shia and Kurds. So then, when Bush Jr. took advantage of September 11th and spun it as an excuse to attack Iraq, he picked up where his father had left off. And he went ahead and not only did he depose Saddam Hussein, but he fought an 8-year war on behalf of the Shia. It was a civil war. And, you know, during that time, if you guys remember back watching, they would say, I mean, never mind the news people, but the government would say, well, it's us and the Iraqi people against the terrorists. We're trying to create a democracy for the people, and the terrorists are trying to stop us, so that's who we're fighting. And no one ever said, well, look, I mean, come on. This guy's name is Sheikh this and that, and this guy's name is Ayatollah whatever the hell, and let's talk about this a little bit, about who's who. They never did. For a decade of this war, they just would never say, okay, there's the United Iraqi Alliance, which is the Shiite parties, the 3 major Shiite parties. And we've taken their side in this war against the Sunni. And it ended up in a massive ethnic sectarian cleansing campaign in Baghdad, where Baghdad is now a better than 85, probably 90% Shiite Arab city. And the Sunnis lost it. So here's the problem with that. That's not what was supposed to happen. Well, that was what was supposed to happen. What was not supposed to happen was Iran was supposed to benefit from it all. What was supposed to happen were the Shia were supposed to be compliant with American wishes. And they were supposed to be so grateful for the fact that America fought their war for them that they would keep us there. And that at the end of the day, come 2008, that they would prefer America to Iran. But of course, that doesn't make any sense at all, because Iran are literally their blood brothers, share that border, and are their permanent neighbors, and we're the invaders, and who betrayed and attacked the different Shiite factions at different times during Iraq War II as well, and so made plenty of enemies there. And so when it came to 2008, George Bush said, all right, how about my 56 bases? And they said, well, you know, let me see. Let me talk to the parliament and see what they say. I'm sorry, you know, the boys, I talked to them, and they're saying, yeah, no. Okay, well, how about, 40 bases? And this went on. Patrick Coburn at The Independent is the best. And he reported this all through the year 2008 of the Dawa Party, Shia Party government there, just stringing Bush along because they knew his term is up. He's done. He's a dead duck come November. And so it's just not going to happen, man. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. Started a war that killed 1 million people to complete this massive shift in power there, and all it did was empower Iran. Now the thing of it is, they knew they realized that was what was happening as early as 2006, which they should have realized as early as 2003. Ask Rip, he knew because I told him. But no, so in 2006, they created a new policy, the redirection. And you can read about this. Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker magazine wrote about this. And this is where we realized that, oops, we just fought a whole war for the people we hate the most, the Iranian Shia. And so now we got to tilt back towards our friends, the Saudis. But in practice, what that meant was backing Al-Qaeda as Saudis' forward shock troops. They don't have a big land army. They bought a lot of equipment from Lockheed over the years, but they don't have a big invasion force other than us. And so basically the deal was, not only did they do this bait and switch where they have the United States attacking all these secular dictators who were enemies of Saddam Hussein, not that we should have been backing them, which is part of what created our problem in the first place. We sure didn't need to be supporting the terrorists to overthrow them. And that was exactly what happened. And it started with George W. Bush. If you read that article, The Redirection, in Lebanon and in Syria, they started backing Fatah al-Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood groups there. And then in Iran, a group called Jandala, which was vicious and kidnapped a bus full of generals and cut their throats and all this stuff. Can you imagine if a bus full of American generals got grabbed and their throats cut, what the reaction to that would be? And this is the kind of terrorism that they were doing. And in fact, then it came out, according to a great journalist and a friend of mine, Mark Perry, he said actually it wasn't even CIA who recruited Jandala. It was Mossad posing as CIA that recruited Jandala to do those killings.
Crazy.
And then they also used the Mujahideen cult, which is this weird communist terrorist cult, to assassinate the scientists in Iran there. So then when Obama came into power, he really did say, and I'm not saying this is to his credit because he should have done nothing, okay? But he did say, the actual Al-Qaeda guys in the world, we are now going to prioritize killing them. And so he unleashed the CIA drone war against them in Pakistan, which had all kinds of horrible consequences, including the attempted Times Square attack of 2010, and including driving of forces that now call themselves ISIS out of Pakistan and into Afghanistan. But it was effective at really killing the last of bin Laden's men, other than Zawahiri, who still prospers in Pakistan somewhere, supposedly. But then, in 2011, and this did happen, I know there's a lot of speculation about this, but my wife is an investigative reporter, and she nailed it down that night, that it was actually really true that, yes, they killed bin Laden in that Navy SEAL raid in Pakistan that night in Abbottabad, and they killed him. But the punchline is that just as Obama's killing Osama and declaring victory in the war on terrorism, he turns right around and he takes Al-Qaeda's side in Libya. And here we had was a simple case of a bunch of politicians in Europe, but for our purposes, especially in Washington, D.C., had no real interest in backstabbing Gaddafi. George Bush had brought him in from the cold in 2003 because he needed to say that something was a good result of invading Iraq. So he pretended that invading Iraq scared Gaddafi into capitulating, which was nonsense. But anyway, he brought him in, and he even renditioned and tortured people and cooperated with Gaddafi in clamping down on the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and these other terrorists. But Susan Rice and Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton, above all, wanted a war. And Samantha Power especially, and this is in Michael Hastings' great reporting in Rolling Stone. I'm getting way into the weeds sometimes, sorry. Samantha Power had called Hillary Clinton a monster when she had supported Barack Obama in the 2008 campaign. So when Obama made Hillary Clinton the Secretary of State, oops, she messed up, stepped too far, so she got relegated to a low-level position on the National Security Council, which she called do-gooder, rinky-dink stuff, like working on Iraqi democracy and reconciliation.
Oh my God.
Yeah, who needs reconciliation in Iraq? She wasn't getting any attention, and yet she had won some prize, maybe the Pulitzer or something, for a book called The Problem from Hell: Why We Need to Intervene When There's a Genocide in a Place like Rwanda. So then Libya became her pretended test case, that this is going to be one of those times where instead of doing nothing, which was wrong, we're going to do something and save the day, and she's going to get a promotion, and which is what happened. And she convinced Hillary Clinton to do it, and Hillary Clinton decided this would be good for her political run in 2016, that she was the hero of the Libya war. They kind of ditched that shtick by the time 2016 rolled around because Libya wasn't looking so hot. But at the time, these were the heroic rebels, even though reporting, because it took 11 months of bombing them, 9.5, 10 months of bombing them to actually accomplish the regime change. So the whole time there were good journalists on the ground there saying that these are jihadists, these are the Libyan veterans of Iraq War II that we just fought in the Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq War II. They've now come home from Libya, just like Al-Qaeda were the guys who'd come home from Afghanistan's war in the 80s. These were the guys who came home from Iraq War II, and here we are taking their side against the wacky Colonel Gaddafi. And then Hillary Clinton called it her bank shot. Let's take these same jihadists and guns and we'll funnel them now that Gaddafi's dead. They just lynched him on the side of the road, shot him in the head. And now that they're done with that, they'll take all the guns and jihadists and funnel them onto Syria. And they started back in the war against the dictatorship in Syria, which just like Assad, just like Gaddafi, was not a real kept pet dictatorship like the King of Jordan or Hosni Mubarak, but he was more or less cooperative. He tortured people for Bill Clinton and for George W. Bush, if that's a test of his loyalty to American goals, including innocent people like Mara Rar, who was just a case of mistaken identity, for God's sake. But anyway, So they started doing this from the very beginning in 2011 and 12, and from the very beginning, the people who didn't have an agenda here but were interested in this were telling you that the veterans, again, from Iraq War II, of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the guys that fought with Zarqawi, the guys that were the leaders of the suicide bomber attacks, the guys who had sworn loyalty to bin Laden and Zawahiri, the butchers of New York City, they're coming back from Iraq into Syria now, and they're taking up this revolution. And where in Iraq War II, the Al-Qaeda guys were really a small marginal part of the insurgency, and they ended up being swept aside pretty readily when the time came. In Syria, they dominated it from the beginning. And the reason, it wasn't just the USA. It was all of our very best allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel, who all supported this effort to bankroll and arm these jihadists, to train them, to this huge propaganda campaign to tell everyone that they're moderates and that their evil fascist dictator, which he is an evil fascist dictator, simply is bombing civilians because he wakes up in the morning and he loves bombing civilians and that's all he wants to do. And so these moderate rebels are trying to resist him, and we're supposed to help them. Even though all along, if you look even 1 inch below the surface, you can see that these guys all along were sworn loyal to Zawahiri. It's the lead group there is called Jabhat al-Nusra, and it's run by a guy named Jolani, and he is the true heir of Zarqawi from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then this also led into a breakoff from Al-Qaeda called ISIS. And this was primarily allowed to come into existence by the Turks and bankrolled by the Saudis. And at first they carved out a piece of eastern Syria, and then just like in all the warnings, they rolled right into the lawless, ungoverned, wide-open western Iraq and declared the Islamic State Caliphate, which was really the worst. If you can imagine a bunch of bin Ladenites controlling a land the size of Great Britain and a population the size of Great Britain for 3 years, yeah, that's about how it was, all right. It was an absolute nightmare. And then, of course, that necessitated Iraq War III, where America then came. See, I skipped the good part, man, I'm sorry. The reason that they hate Assad so much, again, just like in the clean break, is because Assad is friends with Iran, and Assad supports Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and that's a problem for the Israelis. So when, at the time America showed up in 2003, they had what the King of Jordan called the Shiite Crescent, this terrible Axis power from Iran into Syria and southern Lebanon. Well, then George Bush gives them Baghdad too. So right, this is that whole redirection that we're talking about. So you can't restart the Iraq War the other way and cleanse it of Shia and fill it with Sunni in another 8-year genocide. That's too much. But you know what? Maybe we can take out Assad as a consolation prize. And that'll be, to try to make up for the self-inflicted disaster that was Iraq War II. And that was really why so much they wanted to get rid of Assad and focus on there. So, and Obama told Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. Jeffrey Goldberg says, hey man, don't you think that it would weaken Iran if we were to get rid of Assad? And Obama says, it sure would, and we think he's on his way out right now. And Jeffrey Goldberg says, well, is there anything more that we can do to make that happen? And Obama says, yeah, but you don't have high enough clearance. I can't tell you, Jeff. So, in other words, I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you, meaning the CIA is arming and training them as we speak. And we know from Edward Snowden and the heroic leak of those documents that they had a program, it was called Timber Sycamore. They're spending $1 billion a year arming these jihadists. And so this is what resulted in the rise of the Islamic State. Now, Iraq War III, which just finished finally after 3 years of more tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more people killed in war in Fallujah, Tikrit, Ramadi, Mosul, and especially Raqqa, Mosul and Raqqa in eastern Syria there. And who benefits from that? Again, the Iranians. They're the ones who, on the ground, more than the Americans, came to save the day of the Iraqi Shiite forces, the Baghdad government forces, and shore them up when ISIS came. And so they have now increased their power and influence in Iraq that much more. So now that it's 2018, you tune on, Sunday morning news, and they go, oh my God, there's a land bridge, a road. A road. There's a land bridge from Tehran through Baghdad, the Shiite Crescent, right? Through into Syria now, and they've increased their power and influence in Syria as well, having helped to crush the jihadis there. And so now all the neocons, who are the ones who are responsible for all of this, are the ones who want to pretend that nothing I just said ever happened. It's just a brand new day in the world, and all you need to know is, man, Iran has way too much power and influence around here, and something has got to be done to stop them. When really all they've done is open our Christmas presents, you know, just keep handing them power and influence. And then, so I'll just say here at the end, I don't know what it says on here, that one of the worst aspects of this bogus Iran narrative is right now going on in Yemen. And without taking you through all the steps, basically there's a civil war going on. It's now a three-sided war, and the Americans are on at least two of them, fighting for and against Al-Qaeda, for and against the Houthi Shiite forces that they oppose. Now the Houthis are not nice people, whatever. Their fighters are fighters, right? So that's all you need to know about that, I guess. But the point is that they've never attacked the United States. They've never threatened the United States. The only Yemenis who ever attacked the United States did so on September 11th and have sent, they sent the underpants bomber, although the State Department and CIA admit that Patrick Kennedy, Google it, admitted that they let the underpants bomber change planes in the Netherlands and come to the United States because they were trying to track him to see who he talked to, and they didn't know he had a bomb on him. So, good going there. But anyway, it wasn't the Houthis. The Houthis never did anything to us. But hey, guess what? There's a rumor going around that they're a proxy for Iran, that they amount to basically Yemeni Hezbollah, and that they're this force that now, so if Saudi's war against them amounts to, again, a war for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula this time, for Al-Qaeda forces on the ground there, then we just have to look the other way, because anti-Iranian interests are at the core of this, and again, at the core of that is Israel, because they decided back, I mean, and really it's the CIA and the Defense Department too, decided Iran is like a good pseudo-enemy. But the Israelis and the Likud party and their allies in the United States never stopped beating the drum about Iran and the danger they pose. If you just think back to the last 15 years of your life of non-stop lies that the Iranians were making nuclear weapons to murder all the Israelis with, whatever happened to that? They never made a single bomb. You know why? Because they never tried to begin to make one. It doesn't take 15 years to make a simple atom bomb. Come on, guys. What the nuclear deal that Obama signed did was it said, here's your safeguarded, IAEA inspected, perfectly legal civilian nuclear program, and now we're going to extra double safeguard it and inspect it and reduce it. They poured concrete into their heavy water reactor core, disabling it for all time. They turned off 2/3 of their centrifuges. They scaled the whole thing back. So they went from a harmless civilian electricity program to an extra verified to be harmless civilian electricity program, and that's it. And it's the Netanyahu's wing of the Likud party, especially, which I guess is all of it now, agenda there. And so that's a big part of why everything sucks so bad. Oh, here's one more thing. So if we call this off, if we come to the realization that we actually do have probably tens of thousands of people who are sworn bin Ladenites in the world now, or sworn to Baghdadi from ISIS, same difference. I think we can also recognize that actually the smallest percentage of those are really international terrorists bent on attacking Western targets. And I think that history shows, in fact, Robert Pape's work at the University of Chicago shows over and over again, that when the occupations and the bombing campaigns end, the terrorism dries up. You know, Hezbollah waged a suicide attack campaign against Israel for 15 years, 17 years, but the moment that Israel withdrew from Lebanon, they never did it again. And that'd be the same thing for the United States. If, never mind anarchy in action and libertarianism my way or any of this, but if America just called off the empire and just stopped intervening, there's no reason for any of these people to continue to attack us other than old resentments. And at that point, you're talking about people you could count in the tens at the highest, right? Who would want to continue to attack us anyway if we really called it off. So that's not to give in to terrorists. That's just to recognize that our government can't be trusted with a writ to fight terrorism for us. They'll do everything but that, and they'll cause a worse problem for us. And so instead, we need to just demand always that they simply call it all off. Okay, thank you.
and we'll move on.
Sure.
So,
Did I go over time? I'm sorry. That's my
No, it's
question.
fine.
Sorry.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for a fascinating talk. History is really interesting. What I'm wondering is, I lived with a guy who's like really, excited about Israel. He has a Jewish heritage, and he knows a lot of the history and was telling me just a lot about it. And he seems to think, he's not really interested in America protecting itself so much as America protecting Israel. And from his point of view, it's Israel versus all of the pan-Arab, empire. Mm-hmm. So what would you say to someone who believes that that's the reason that America's there? That's the whole point of it.
Well, I think that does have a lot to do with it. I disagree that it should be, or that it's even necessary, really, at all. Or that it's even really correct that Israel is, faced by implacable enemies. They have a very friendly regime in Egypt, a friendly regime in Jordan. They've had peace deals with for decades. They numerous times have been on the verge of a permanent peace deal with Syria and had the Americans intervene and stop them for various reasons at various times. Politics, basically. And a lot of times the Israel lobby and the neocons in America can be to the right of the actual government policies in Israel and have a worse framing of it. But I think personally that the occupations of the West Bank and Gaza, and of course including Jerusalem, especially East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights even, that is what is untenable, really. That if the Israelis took the 67 borders of the 48 borders, the 48 armistice line, basically the same thing there. If they just took those borders and left it at that, instead of, because see, when they created Israel, there was what was called the Nakba, where they ethnically cleansed 750,000 Arabs out of the area. So that's sustainable. I'm not saying it's moral, but they won their super duper majority, 80-20 Jewish super majority within the borders of Israel. And they got away with that. And I think if they would be happy with that, that would be one thing. But instead, since 67, they have occupied the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and deprived them of their rights in the worst ways, in just merciless tyranny. There's no other way to describe the way they treat them. And so this is what drives so much of the animus. 48 was a long time ago, and people still don't like it, and I'm not saying it's fair. To have Israelis when like some old grandma saying, that's my house, and this guy's living in it. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying at least it's sustainable. On the map, it makes sense. What doesn't make sense is a permanent occupation over 6 million people and depriving them of their rights, and in perpetuity for a longer time than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe, in fact. Now, so whether that has a lot to do with why America is over there at all, I think it does have a hell of a lot to do with it. I don't know that our imperialists really understand economics, but yeah, it's not the oil. If it's the oil, it's strategic dominance, so that if we have a war with China, we can turn off the spigot to them. But it's not about like, oh, we have to have that oil. We can buy that oil on the market and save a hell of a lot of money. But so for the neoconservative movement, it absolutely is all about Israel. And they're at mondoweiss.org. Philip Weiss has these two great quotes from two of the most important founding fathers of the neoconservative movement, Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol's father, and Norman Podhoretz, who's the whole Podhoretz clan. John is his son, but Commentary Magazine and that entire crew. And both of these quotes say, hey, listen, our interest is Israel, and whatever the excuse is, China or Europe or Japan or whatever, Afghanistan, whatever it is, we must always have reasons to keep America engaged in the world, to keep America's active role, because the traditional point of view of the American people is to mind their own business. Unless there's a real crisis, they feel like they have to defend themselves. And so we have to keep them engaged so that they will always be available to Israel, to protect Israel. And it's treachery. Frankly, really, it's not, exactly treason, but it's certainly, disregarding the importance of the opinions of the rest of American society, which, is very Zionist anyway, I guess. But they sure do shovel a lot of BS in order to keep it that way. Go ahead.
Scott, I'll admit I spend a lot of time on some alt-right boards, and their hatred for Jews and for Muslims is very intense. How do you think the rise of the alt-right is going to fuel on this? I mean, they, I don't disagree with them on that either. It's unfortunately.
Well, honestly, I don't think, even now, I really don't think that the American people are very receptive to the alt-right argument. I mean, this is a country of 300 million people, and like 45% of them aren't white, and probably 99% of those who are white don't give a shit what some Nazi thinks or care
They're
about that at all. So, well, anyway, it's national socialism. Call it what you want, but
you're a very responsible journalist, and that's a very irresponsible thing for you to say.
Whatever.
I've known you.
You know what? I'm really not impressed with any kind of right winger at all, and so whatever. I honestly, I don't see their influence on policy anywhere. So when I do, then I'll complain about that. Go
Do you
ahead.
have time for another one, or is it?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah.
Did you bring some books along?
Yes. Oh yeah. I brought some books if anybody wants to buy them.
And then
I wrote a book about Afghanistan. It's bad. I mean, the book is great. The Afghanistan is bad.
Yeah, so I want to ask you a question about Israel that I've never been able to really understand, and maybe nobody does, but perhaps you could shed some light on it. So we look at Israel almost as the 51st state that we are by God going to protect no matter what, and it seems like there's been an awful lot of death and destruction and mayhem and money spent, trillions and trillions of dollars revolving around this, the country of Israel. And how did it get to that point where we look at it as some sort of protected father?
Well, I mean,
And why? As you say,
it's
they've got.
it's the same. It's the same as any lobby. They're just really good at it. And the fact of the matter is, like, if you ask on Capitol Hill who are the biggest lobbies, they'll say the AARP, guns, in Israel.
Yeah.
To them, it's just one of the lobbies that's effective at getting work done. Like if you think about the ladies who do the March of Dimes, and their job is to call everyone on their telephone tree, and everyone they call is supposed to call everyone on their telephone tree. Well, that's how the Israel lobby does it, and they do the work, and they put their time in, and they're ruthless. They're absolutely ruthless, and they're willing to break the law to a great degree too. If you follow the work of Grant Smith, you get to see plenty of that. But just when it comes to being a congressman, if you're a member of the House of Representatives and you vote against Israel once, that's like Jabba the Hutt put a death mark on you. You're done. And they will bankroll your primary opponent, and if you beat him, they will bankroll your general election opponent, and if you beat him, then we'll see you in 2 years. And they'll never forget it. And there's plenty of anecdotes of that from very powerful senators even, who made one false move and the Israel lobby took them down. And then you can't even say it's the Israel lobby that took me down, or else you're a vicious anti-Semite. And so, this kind of thing. And so they're basically make themselves bulletproof from accusations of power and influence, even though they do everything they can. Israel lobby groups, as Grant Smith calls them, the Israel affinity organizations. They do everything they can to amass as much power as they can, to limit the influence of anybody who would say otherwise, and to help their friends too. So the Saudi and Turkish lobbies need help in DC. The Israelis are there to help them along too. And then, and plus, see, here's the real key. It's the neocons. It's the neocon, and look, the Israel, AIPAC, they're Americans. They're not Israelis. They just really like Israel, right? Well, the neoconservatives too. And what happened was, the oil men and the bankers already had their think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, with their dictated policy for 80 years, something, 75. But then, so the Israeli, the neoconservative. Oh well, I'm skipping ahead. So the oil and banking had their CFR, but the new right, the military-industrial complex that grew up after World War II, they had a lot of weapons to sell to the Pentagon. But they didn't really have any doctrines So they needed to hire a bunch of intellectuals to write up excuses for their policies, the same way the Rockefellers had with the CFR. And so they hired the neoconservatives from the Israel lobby, led by Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and all those guys. And starting in the late 1970s, they all got brought on board with Lockheed, especially, and Northrop Grumman and the rest of them. And so, I mean, especially if you look at the neoconservatives in the first Bush Jr. administration, every single one of them had worked with Lockheed at some point in the past. And even Stephen Hadley was the lawyer for Lockheed. And that's kind of
sick.
Yeah, so that's the deal. Is the arms salesman needed some eggheads, and they hired the neocons and bankrolled the neocons, and then they set up the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs and Center for Security Policy and all those on and on, PNAC especially, which is now called the Foreign Policy Initiative. Anyways, sorry. Am I done? Am I going? Go ahead.
So yeah, what do you think is going to happen with our relationship with like Turkey and the Kurds?
Man, well, so yeah, I didn't really,
Should we
for
go
good
fight
reason.
with the Kurds, all of us?
No, they're really screwed because they made a deal with America again, and that's America's thing, is screwing the Kurds. You know, in the 70s, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger made a bunch of big promises to the Iraqi Kurds and armed them up against Saddam, helped Iran, basically made promises to them that they would accept Iran's help to fight against Saddam. But when Saddam started coming for them, the Iranians took off, and Henry Kissinger left them high and dry. And this is where you get those famous quotes where he says, "It is better to be America's enemy because at least you know where we stand." And it's where he admitted that himself. And then, of course, as I said, George Bush Sr. left them high and dry after encouraging the uprising in 1991 after the first Iraq War. And then now it's on to the Syrian Kurds, where, like I said, American efforts there to back the jihadis against Assad turned into the Islamic State, and that got so out of control that led to Iraq War III, which meant backing the Shia in Iraq, but it meant backing the Syrian Kurds there, who are apparently great fighters and got a lot of work done as the ground forces for the Americans in attacking the Islamic State in Raqqa.
The Syrian Kurds, is that the Peshmerga?
No, the Peshmerga, the Iraqis. These are the Syrian Defense Forces, they're called, which is really just the YPG, which is the Syrian branch of the Turkish PKK, which are, they're sort of former Marxists turned Murray Bookchinists, if anybody's ever heard of Murray Bookchin. In a group like this, you might have. So he was a sort of a left anarcho-syndicalist type. But so now that they've served their purpose, they're really in limbo because the U.S. NATO allies, the Turks, consider them, just the Syrian branch of the PKK, to be a terrorist group, and for them to have this not just semi, but pretty damn autonomous region there in northern Syria, such a really bad example for the PKK if that's allowed to go unpunished. So now we have the Turkish government is bombing the hell out of them, at least west of the Euphrates, and I'm actually a week or so behind on the maps, but yeah, it's absolutely everybody, you know, America fighting on 2-3 sides of this war. And at points in the past, you literally had CIA-backed jihadists fighting in pitched battles with the Syrian Defense Force, DOD, military-backed, Kurdish fighters. And this has gone on for years. And now, in fact, after they rousted the Islamic State out of Raqqa, these guys all went and signed up as mercs for the Turks, now fighting against the Kurdish forces that we're backing. And the American Marines apparently so far are sitting back and letting this happen. And this is a deal that they've made with Erdogan that I guess he's allowed to go so far but not further. But I don't know about that even. In fact, there have been statements out of Turkey where they say, we don't give a damn if they're Americans there. We're doing whatever the hell we want, and you better get the hell out of our way. It sounded like maybe they meant it. So, you know, yeah, no, times look really tough for them. I mean, compared to living under the Islamic State, but then that's the USA's fault in the first place too, so. Yeah. All right.
Anybody else? I was going to ask if you could just touch on the atrocities in Yemen right now, because I think that's one of the worst things that's happening in the world, and, you know, where do you think that's going?
Well, so it's just right at the 3rd anniversary now of this war. So Obama was bombing Al-Qaeda there since 2009, and he was bribing the government there to let him do it. And that was just making Al-Qaeda more and more powerful at the time anyway, as drone strikes do. And then when the Arab Spring came in 2011, virtually all factions in the country agreed they wanted to overthrow the American-backed dictator Saleh. And then there were some assassination attempts, and so he had to let go and convalesce and was out of power. And the Saudis and Hillary Clinton arranged to put the new guy in there. But the former dictator took his army divisions with him and said, screw you guys, man, I do what I want. So he went and joined forces with his old enemies, the Houthis, the Shiite group out of the north. Turns out he's a Zaydi Shia like them. He just wasn't part of their political group, the Houthis. He'd attacked them in the past. Then he allied with them. They marched down on the capital city of Sana'a. And even Barack Obama admitted this on tape, it's on YouTube, where Obama admits that the Iranians warned them not to take the capital city, that you're going to cause the Saudis to freak out and bomb you and start a war, so don't do it. And Obama even admitted that the Iranians, in fact, a journalist told me recently, they warned them numerous times, they begged them basically not to do it. But their prophecy came true. As soon as the Houthis took the capital city, the Saudis launched this air war. And this is, as bad as anything George Bush has done in just strictly moral terms. I mean, if you want to count skulls, then he's still in the lead by probably not very much. But for the level of cynicism involved, this is as bad as Iraq War II, where it's in the New York Times, and this is no scoop by, James Risen used to do investigative reporting there or something like that. This is just a press release from the Obama White House. It's sourced to like 17 White House officials, National Security Council officials, obviously sanctioned by the president himself. This is what we're going to tell the New York Times about the Yemen war. And it says in there that they knew that telling the Saudis okay and helping them launch this war, that the war itself would be long, bloody, and indeterminate. Long, bloody, and indeterminate. In other words, we don't have a playbook for how this is supposed to end up with any kind of end state, how we want it. But we're going to start it anyway. We're going to kill a lot of people, and then I guess we'll see what happens later. Long, bloody, and indeterminate. That's what they admitted to themselves before they started it. But then I know you think there must have been some good reason, but it says in that same paragraph right there in the New York Times, it's the third paragraph, second paragraph maybe of the article, is that they had to placate the Saudis after the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the Iran nuclear deal secures Saudi Arabia's interests. If you want to pretend that Saudi ever really believed the Iranians were making nukes and they were scared of that, then, hey, the Iranian nuclear deal is badass because they poured a bunch of concrete right in their heavy water reactor. No plutonium for them. So what's your problem? Just saved your bacon, right? But of course, that was all a hoax. They never were making nuclear weapons. The deal was basically superfluous. But what it did do was it destroyed the narrative of the threat of the Iranian nuclear weapon for a little while. And that threatened the Saudis. They believed their place in America's order in the Middle East. And they thought the question had been raised, which this was foolish. There's no way. But they thought that this was the possibility that Obama was going to start tilting back toward Iran, like it was back in the old days, where we had the periphery strategy, control the Arabs by backing the Persians and the Kurds and the Turks, right? So that was not ever true, but that was why they did it. And then the now crown prince of Saudi Arabia was then the deputy crown prince, brand new, just got the job as deputy crown prince and defense minister. And so he had his own little Samantha Power thing going on, where he had to make a mark for himself in Saudi politics by starting a war. And so that was a big part of why he did it, and it worked for him too. And he's now the crown prince, pushing his uncles aside and ready to become the king as soon as his old man dies, which will be soon. Okay, I've taken up way too much of y'all's time. Thank you so much.